Hello, everyone. This is Conversations from the Alcove, the new play development program at the Lucille Lortel Theater. My name is Caridad Svich. I'm the artistic director of the Alcove new play development program. And our guest today is Leigh, wonderful playwright, whom you see on the other side of the screen from me. And yay, a little wave from Eve. And a little know about what Conversations from the Alcove is about. If you've never been here before, casual conversations on arts and ideas, playwriting, theater, performance, and things in the world related to all those things, as part of thinking about how new plays exist in the world, and how they are part of the cultural fabric, which sometimes they get put off to a little side. We're not on the side, we're in the center, I feel. So welcome if you haven't been here before, and if you have, wherever you're finding this on the channel, in your viewing out in the world, then know that we're here for you. I'll do a little introduction of Eve. I'll make it very short, but just to say that wonderful playwright, first of all, whom you should know about. Their plays include Pinocchio, which was at the Unicorn Theater in London, also Midnight Movie, which was at the Royal Court, Wildfire Road, which was at the Crucible Theater in Sheffield, The Trick at the Bush Theater, and many more. They're also, I can't list everything because it's too many things, but that's all good, right? And also, they're an associate artist with Coney, and have done work outside of London and Germany and other countries, and more good things. I will not bore you to tears with many introductions because I know we want to get to the good stuff, which is meeting Eve and talking about many things in the arts. So welcome, Eve, and anything you want to add to that intro, please do.
No, thank you very much.
Yay, cool. So I wanted to start with a slightly heavy question, but it's one that I'm asking like everyone who's taking part in this series because, you know, this is the world we're living in. So one of them has to do with the idea of emergencies and emergence, right? So we're living in a time wildfires, floods, famine, etc. Exponentially.
Don't forget plague.
Yes, plagues, exponential climate change, interpandemic. So, you know, we're in a time of crisis, right? And historically, perhaps people might say, well, it's always been a time of crisis. However, not at a point where it's code red for the planet. So I think this is what makes this time uniquely different than other times of crisis. And so I wanted to sort of ask where and how, why, where, how, and why make theater, but really how do we approach emergency and emergence at this time? And this is something that I think is very central to your work, Eve, and so I wanted to start in that place.
Yeah, something that I think about a lot is the idea of, like it's something that I say when I'm trying to explain what my work is like, I know some playwrights are really intrigued by the idea that the year you're born and therefore the year that certain like formative historical events happen to you, or that you're a part of them, really shape your perspective on the world. And I definitely feel like, you know, I'm somebody who was 16 when 9/11 happened, who was 14 when in the time of the 2000 election. I think actually the judgment came down on my 15th birthday, although I might be remembering that wrong. And yeah, I feel like this idea of moving from calamity to calamity and emergency to emergency is something that I really feel when I think about the end of my childhood and kind of moving into beginning to think about being an adult. And yeah, something that I often say when I'm trying to explain my work is like, that there's this idea of rehearsed emergency, of rehearsing for an emergency, and of having an emergency, the kind of paradox of having an emergency at the same time, at this, like every night in the same room, that feels like it's getting very close to the bone of what it is that I'm trying to do. Um, uh, and yeah, I think it's very important to ask that question of like, what are we doing? Why do this? And particularly something that I felt I was getting from what you were saying is not why do this, let's all quit.
No, let's not all
But
quit,
like,
please.
it is very important to do this. Let us try and articulate together why that is. And I completely share your conviction that theater as a reflective space is like going to be our lungs when it is already our lungs, but like when our lungs are even more imperiled than they are right now. Um, uh, and yeah, and I do think I don't feel that I have like a conclusive or satisfying answer, but I do think there is something about gathering to intentionally experience an emergency together, which feels essential to beginning to make sense of the world we're living in.
Yeah, agreed. And I also think there might be something in that I sort of wanted to address maybe issues of form as a playwright. Um, Obviously, something that's central to our work. How do we think about the form that the work is in, the shapes, the many shapes that it may take? Um, and because I do think there is a shift from, so slight sidebar, reading work, and thinking, and also sometimes working with students, right? So student writers, one of the things I keep saying is, the world has changed and we have to make things that reflect that world. And it's cool to also make retro things, right? Like there's a room for that, right? Because there's a place for longing and nostalgia and all that stuff. But it can also be a very deadly place, a kind of trap. Um, and it's how do you kind of like apprehend the forms that are with us, the forms that are necessary to grapple with emergency as a playwright, right? So how does the vehicle that you construct actually truly reflect the world? And I feel like that's very true in your work. I feel like the forms of the pieces um, are also, it's not just the content, right? So I hate that word, but I'll use it just for a second. But like the forms are actually exploring, right? The play is the thing; it's not pointing somewhere else, right? So the form is exploring exactly the navigation of, through, contending with, and finding sometimes positivity, sometimes negativity, but finding those spaces through emergencies, right? I think it's the space through that theater can really articulate. So yeah, so I don't know if you wanted to address how you maybe looking at different pieces of yours of like choices around form.
Yeah, I feel like when I'm asked to give workshops in the UK, um, which is mostly where I've asked to give workshops. um, yeah, people are always like, "Can you please do something on form?" Like the children are upset about form, like, um, and I'm always like, "It's not just about form, you guys." Like, I'm not only interested in form, but the reason why people tend to ask that is because I am very interested in form. And yeah, and I share a conviction with you. I think that yeah, the form and the substance of the play are they're the same thing. Um, uh, yeah, and I love your use of the word retro when talking about form. partly because I've spent the day working on a play set basically in a haunted house. And so I've been thinking a lot about what that form is and kind of like the expectations of storytelling that we have of haunted houses, and the ways in which those expectations can be confounded or not. And also like, yeah, what the kind of everybody in the same roomness does to trying to scare people. Um, uh, and yeah, I mean, obviously that's an experiment, and like all experiments, we'll just see how it goes. um, but yeah, uh, I think that's something that feels very important in terms of discovering theatrical form in the present is social media, because social media is constant narrative making, and actually something that I've genuinely been like thinking about with a certain amount of apprehension uh, in the kind of last like 3 years, I guess I would say. Like I still haven't joined TikTok, and I sort of don't want to. I mean, I don't want to, although I enjoy other people's TikToks when they come across like my like elder millennial timelines. Um, but yeah, I'm like, I feel like the grammar of storytelling is being so shaped by TikTok, and by like successive form by Snapchat, like by like, you know, kind of mutating forms of social media. Um, and I think that oftentimes older people, and I obviously include myself in this, I don't know, it's like one of the, I feel like we think a lot these days about the ways in which kind of visual culture seems to have stagnated, and kind of youth culture seems to be on a constant, like in terms of like clothes and aesthetics, on a bit of a loop with variations of like a 20-year loop. And I understand where that anxiety is coming from, but I actually think it's sort of misguided. I think what it is that the way in which youth culture is mutating things is not as much in the visual world. It's in the story world, and you can see like the grammar of storytelling on social media, but especially on TikTok, is incredibly sophisticated. And I really think that one is at risk of no longer telling stories in a legible and dynamic way if one is not paying attention to these developments, which is why I'm like, do I join TikTok? But also, like, I don't know, I already have too much spyware on my my digital life. I don't want more, so I haven't done it yet. But yeah, I think that form. This is a lot of words to basically say that, like, form. When we're talking about form, we're talking about how we tell stories, how we apprehend information, and like what is the most pleasurable way of apprehending all of the information that we need to apprehend in order to understand this story. Sometimes I think about form when I'm trying to draft something, and to redraft as well, of course, as like trying to climb a mountain. And to be clear, in my life, I have never climbed a mountain. But yeah, that it's like if you're the playwright, you're kind of the guide up the mountain. So you need to know all of the terrain, and like what is the most kind of enjoyably, dangerously pleasurable way up the mountain. It might not be the straight way, or the straight way might be inaccessible for any number of reasons. So yeah, those are some thoughts about form.
Yeah, totally. And I think that there's, it, we may also look at, like, do you ever start with the form? Like, I wonder about that. Like, sometimes I'll be writing and I'll be like, I want to make a fugue, or I want to make something
so
that
cool.
feels like a string quartet. Do you know what I mean? Like, do you ever start with that, with something that becomes your kind of formal container, or do you discover it as you go?
Yeah, I definitely, I often do. I feel like I almost like most often do. Of like, I wanna make a play that feels like the internet, or like I wanna make a play that feels like the internet at 3 in the morning when you're in pain, and that's Midnight Movie. Um, or yeah, I mean, even this haunted house play is like, I like, um, I want to make something that feels like a pop song, which is kind of like in my head, like, yeah, like a haunted house play is maybe a bit like a pop song. Um, uh, or I want something that I've written a play called, maybe I shouldn't say this because it hasn't been produced yet. Whatever. I've written a play that very few people have read because it hasn't been produced yet, called Fen Western. And as you can tell, it's a Western. Um, and somebody that I really respect saw it at a reading and was like, "This is a Taylor Swift song." And I was like, "Thank you." Obviously, if I was like a hardcore country person, maybe I'd be like, "It's a George Strait song" or something. But I don't think so. I think it is a Taylor Swift song. Um, and this is a person who often writes like very formally naughty, um, very cerebral work. And I was just like, I don't know. Yeah. Um, and actually, speaking of country music, there's, um, the song "Ode to Billy Joe"
Right?
by Bobby Gentry.
Sure.
Gentry. Sorry if I'm pronouncing it wrong. That's a really
Bobby
embarrassing
Gentry,
mistake for an
yeah.
American to make. Bobby Gentry. Uh, yeah. For a long time, I've been wanting to steal that structure and write something, and one day I will do it,
Yeah, it's
because
such
I
an
love
no, I just wanted to say it's such an incredible song. It's
it.
like
Really.
it's epic. It's epic.
It is epic. It's so epic. It's so like, um, something that, I mean, not that it's about small things, but so much of the lyrical focus is on small things. And the theater maker Vladimir Sherban, who I worked with briefly a few years ago, used to always say it's the little things that kill us. Um, and it's like, yeah, it is about death, and it is
Yeah.
not a little thing. But like I don't know, yeah, the sense of scale in that song is so amazing and just feels so much like life. Um, and yeah, I think I'm really attracted to, I mean, you can see this clearly in Wildfire Road, which was, as you say, I was on it in Sheffield, uh, and in Bonn, actually, in Germany, and we're hoping that it may be on in other cities as well. Um, that it's about like, we're in a catastrophe within a catastrophe, um, and when a flight is this long, drinks are free. Um, and it's like, yeah, just like how, I don't know, trying to live in this kind of weird layers um, of mundanity and catastrophe.
Yeah, yeah, of course. As we're living now, we're in interpandemic, and there was somebody the other day on Twitter that was like, how can it be possible that we can still go to do our groceries and at the same time, be living through this time, right? And it's like, yeah, that's what it's like, right? Like the absolutely mundane is next to the catastrophic,
Totally.
which makes it more heightened. And I think that actually, from a political angle, um, I would say the denial of that, right, from many leaders, is what's causing, I think, even more trauma, right? Because we're living through time of extraordinary global trauma,
Yeah.
and then leaders are like, "No, it isn't. No, it isn't," and you're like, "Oh my God,
So fascinating, isn't
please
it?
stop!
I mean,
Please stop saying that!" Right?
it's totally horrifying, but it's also like, what is what? Like, um, and I feel as if uh, maybe maybe my perspective on this is all wrong, but I think it's when maybe we're about to have to edit something out, but I feel like when I look at the Democrats in particular, I'm just like, like, how can you keep pretending that it's 1997? like, wow, you are so committed to pretending that Dianne Feinstein is compos mentis and Clinton is still in the White House.
Yeah.
And I mean, whatever, we could keep going on. And these things were emergencies, to be entirely sure, in 1997 as well.
Absolutely.
But like, it is so spooky to me. Obviously, I think political orthodoxies in the UK where I live are also like just fascinatingly oozing and necrotic and terrible. And I say fascinating, like I hope it doesn't sound like I'm in any way like distanced from it, but it is just like it's almost hard to know how to react. But it's like it's somehow a different set of they're living in a different imaginary world, I would
Yeah.
say.
Yeah. And I think it's related to, I reread, Ma- it's a very theater geeky thing to do, but I reread Mac Wellman's essay, The Theater of Good Intentions, last night, which is an essay that I read at least once a year, if not
I mean,
more.
making a note.
So it was written in 1984, and it's about many things. I mean, it's mostly about um, looking at the confounding nature of what is called the American well-made play, sometimes referred to as the issue play, or there are other names for it.
I think over here people are often calling it the State of the Nation
The
play.
State of the Nation play, yes, and then it's also an essay about toxic positivity. Uh, from, as Mac states it, a very particular U.S. Um, and maybe this translates to other cultures, but I feel like it's particular to the U.S. This notion of, if we just smile through everything, it will be fine. That there's a kind of veneer, a kind of clinging to a false mask of joy that will sort of get you through. And I think that this creates, and part of the essay is about, he says something I'm going to paraphrase it, but that in US drama, it's very hard to write a tragedy because you're not allowed to as a playwright. And that playwrights at some point in their writing life in the US are faced, if they're thinking about it, they're faced with this dilemma that actually an authentic, in quotation marks, because that word gets overused, but like a genuine grappling with the tragic uh, is just not allowed in the theater. And what replaces it is a kind of, as he says it, a sort of pseudo pessimism. If you want to approach anything tragic, it becomes pseudo pessimistic because you have to redeem it somehow in the end, or you have to explain evil, for example. And so anyway, I've been thinking about that in relationship to false joy, projections of false joy, and how that affects playwriting when you're in culture, right? So you're kind of moving through culture, and you're like, okay, I'm writing my thing, and now I'm going to engage with an audience, and an audience that's been inured to perhaps messaging, kind of manufactured consent, right? So many things, and then you're sort of bringing an experience. You're sort of sharing an experience with an audience, um, and how do you walk them through contending with the tragic when we're in a culture that's rejecting the tragic at every turn. So I just want to put that out there. Obviously, there are no easy answers, but it's something that has been on my mind, and maybe something that resonates with you.
Yeah, I think that's a really important and difficult challenge, and if I had to predict what is to come, which of course I don't have to, and in general people who try wind up making fools of themselves, but I would imagine that challenge is not going to get any easier in the coming years for at least a while. I think that I'm thinking about a couple of really great tragedies one of which I saw and one of which I read recently and couldn't kind of bring myself to see, which have both been on in the UK. One is A Streetcar Named Desire, which my husband was in. So I got to see it twice. I'm like one of the few people who got to see it twice.
Is this the, just for clarity, is this the Rebecca Fracknell?
The Rebecca Fracknell production, yes.
Okay.
With Anjana Vazan and Paul Mescal and Patsy Farad, and who were all exactly as good as you've heard. And I hope New York may get a chance to see it. Obviously, I have no knowledge about that whatsoever, like for real. They're trying, aren't they? I'm sure they're trying. Anyway, yeah. I mean, that was a phenomenally articulated tragedy. And the other one that I'm thinking of is Further Than the Furthest Thing, which is by Zinni Harris, which was on at the Young Vic recently, which I couldn't bring myself to see because as I was reading, it's such a classic tragedy. I mean, I was just like, because I knew that by reputation that it was a very good play, but I hadn't read it. And it was just like these feeling of these like massive granite blocks that are just closing off any avenues of escape that you get when you're like, especially when you don't have an idea of how the story is supposed to go and you're just experiencing it. That is so terrifying. And it really, Aristotle is not my fave, but he was not kidding about that catharsis and how necessary it feels. And it feels almost like the opposite of, I don't wish to villainize social media, far from it. But it feels like social media is kind of like almost quite opposed to catharsis. And that's one of the reasons that it's driving us all insane, is that there's no space for that, like storytelling that's just like heavy and like, but I don't know, heavy in like in the way that it is satisfying to push your whole body against something and have it not move or barely move. A form that I am really drawn to, and this conversation is making me think that I need to examine that a little bit and maybe push against it, is a form that a friend of mine talked about as, this is like a friend from uni. He talked about the late romances, the Shakespeare plays, as tragedies that Shakespeare couldn't bear to write, where you can see him setting up the tragedy and you can see him being like, and that there's something not necessarily not satirical at all, but like somehow a commentary on the way that life tends to go, in the way that things, often supernaturally go right, that kind of have no right to go right. And yeah, I've been thinking about that, the idea of like the late romances, or of writing romances in that way, of like setting up a tragedy and then being like, but no, like this is what happened, and this is what happened, and this is what happened. But this conversation is making me think that like maybe I need to, like, I don't know, lay my body against some granite and push a bit harder and see if there's any scope for, I don't know, see what a proper classic tragedy would be like.
Yeah. And I think the late romances are fascinating because, they're often approached as problem plays. You know what I mean? Like they don't. Everybody's like, well, they don't quite work, and they're weird, and then it's like, yeah, right. Like the world is weird, and it doesn't quite work. You know what I mean? Like I think that those plays are, and yes, some of them, like as theater, don't achieve entirely their ends, but I feel like what is fascinating about those late romances is that they're, in some ways, I mean, this may sound kind of nutty thing to say, but how I think in some ways they're more honest about the reality, what life is. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
it's kind of like the tragic plays are tragic, and they because he built a lot of them on the plot of revenge tragedy. So he kind of follows those story beats, and obviously he does his own thing with it. But the romances are this fascinating mix where it's like, yes, I'm going to set up the revenge tragedy, or I'm going to set up, whatever the family story, and it's something's going to happen, or the political tragedy. But then these like other things start kind of like angling. I sometimes think of this is kind of an odd reference, but bear with me. So did you ever see Shock-Headed Peter when Improbable did it?
No, I heard it was amazing, and it was in New York when I was in New York, but I think I was also too young. I like saw adverts for it, but
Yeah,
I didn't get it.
it
Didn't
was
get to it.
so cool. I'm sure they've recorded it. I don't know why they just don't release it to the world. But anyway,
Mhm.
there was this moment in Shock-Headed Peter. I think a lot about the staging of that, where the characters. It was kind of like a box set, and there were all these doors, and there was one moment where the characters just kind of like pushed, just all you saw was like their hands through the doors, and it was kind of scary and weird. And when I think of the late romances, I think of that. I think of like there's this box set where there's a story happening that we kind of understand or know or are familiar with in some way, shape, or form, and then these hands start, kind of like intervening, and the romances, those hands are like the supernatural, or they're a different, like a subplot
The
takes
statue comes
over.
to life,
Yeah,
or
statue comes to life, or another
you
plot
realize
takes
you've
over.
properly ruined your life, but surprise,
Surprise, right?
you thought you killed both of your children, but one of them is still alive, and the statue is suddenly your wife, and your old age has been given back to you in a
Right.
completely different way.
Yeah. And they're just wonderful. When I was in grad school, I was obsessed with Cymbeline,
Oh,
which, that place is kind of a mess, right? So, and I was like, but I wanted to crack it open. I was like, I'm determined. I am determined to like figure out Cymbeline out, because nobody else was into it, and I was like, this is my lodestar, right? And it was ironic because it's not a play that I prior to that had been obsessed with, but maybe because of grad school, and maybe because I was so stressed out, Cymbeline became my lodestar. So anyway, but I think about Cymbeline a lot because it has so many uh, detours formally. You're in one part of the story, it turns again, this takes over, the other section of the story takes over. Um, and and what happens is you feel you're on a completely unsteady ground in that play, which I think expresses something about uncertainty in the world. And I think a lot about like, again, this notion of like, what is the realm of uncertainty? I just participated with Coney, did this part of their pop-up playhouse. They did a magic trick, which is one of their online shows that Tasso Stevens was running. And the lead question for it before you came into the room was, how do you live in the time of uncertainty? And write 5 statements down on a piece of paper about how you can express that, and you're going to bring that into the room as an audience and as a player. And I was like, that feels like Cymbeline. You know what I mean?
wow.
Like it feels like, how do you? And I love this idea of like, how do you prep an audience? And I'm not saying that Shakespeare does that, but but I'm saying like, as artists, we also have that place of like, how do you prepare the audience for the experience? How do you think about them? There's a part of writing where it's like you're just kind of writing, and you're in it and all those things. But there's also a part of writing, because we're writing for performance, which is how do I what is that engagement with the audience? How do I bring them in? How do I construct this event? What kind of party am I hosting, right? And this notion of coming in with statements was just already being put in a space of like, in a way, like this is the theme, reflections on the theme before you walk in. I was like, such a genius thing to do. So I was thinking about like in constructing plays, what are ways that we can do that? Maybe they're simple, maybe they're like, for on-site performances or for online performances, how do you create that space for that to occur? Which replaces the idea, or maybe is adjacent to the idea of the foyer or the lobby, right? Like in the lobby, we kind of hang out and see people and whatever, or click online or go into the chat and go, hey, where you are, all that stuff. But there's also that space where it could also be preparation for getting yourself into the mindset required to apprehend and be part of the experience. So I don't know if any of that resonates with you. I'm throwing it out there, but I've been thinking about it. So yeah.
I think that's really, really important. Yeah, I think, I don't know, just in general, being more intentional and aware of when the performance begins and when it ends is really important. And it's sort of one of these things that gets, I feel like people get really interested in it like every 3 years and then they forget about it. And something that I don't know, like I feel like I keep talking about like a friend of mine, but so Steph O'Driscoll said this to me a while back. I hope she doesn't mind my saying it now, but if she does, I think it will be too late. I'm really sorry, Steph. Anyway, it's very important to her to make work for audiences that are like the people she grew up with and her family, who are mostly working class audiences who don't necessarily have a lot of experience in theater buildings. And the thing that you were saying about the lobby and about like, I don't know, how to get people in, how to begin the performance, has really reminded me that she made a show and her aunt was going to see it. And her aunt rang her and was like, I'm at the theater. What do I do? And she was like, what do you mean? And the aunt was like, I'm outside the theater. What do I do? And she was like, go in the building. And she was like, okay, like, are you sure? But it was just like, there was something so obviously hostile about the way that it was designed or something, where it was like, she was at the theater and she, it was really clear to her that she was in the wrong place or she was about to do the wrong thing. And she needed to check in with her niece in order to continue. And yeah, I think, yeah, especially those of us who habitually go to the theater, regardless of, obviously, like, depending on your background, you can feel from the start really at home, or that can be maybe harder won or whatever. But yeah, that thing of like, I'm at the theater, what do I do? Is just such a, I don't know, it's such a perfect crystallization of that question of like, how do we begin the show? When does the show begin actually? And what are the obstacles that we're facing in order to make the work that we really want to make? And yeah.
Yeah, I think that where does the show begin? In a way, for the audience, for the fellow participant, that the show begins, I mean, there are many ways to trace this, right? It could be when they first heard about it.
Yes,
they saw
absolutely.
a poster, or they saw something online, or like wherever somebody told them about it, right? So it begins in your mind like, or it begins with an image, or it begins you heard something, or like, and it sort of starts, if you don't know anything about it, like unless it's something you're like, unless it's been done a million times and you know, it's like Hamilton, right? I think, oh yeah, it's about, you know, it's that. But if if it's a new play, a new show, a new musical, whatever it may be, puppets, you don't know, right? So you're like, oh, I wonder, I have a title, maybe I have something that I've heard about it, and your brain starts to create a narrative often about what it could be, right? And if you're somebody that's, you know, online a lot, then you're like trying to find out about it, trying to find out about it as much as you can. But if you're not, because there's something beautiful about mystery, there's something beautiful about like not knowing, right? So like just living with this idea of like the header, right? The header being the title, or being the, or maybe just an image, right? That sort of carries you into the experience. And there's that thing of like, well, if you're physically going to the event, of like that's in your brain as you're getting there, right? Like, well, and there's also like, where is the event taking place? You know, is it outdoors? Is it indoors? Is it a building that's historically excluded you? And all the sort of trappings around that, right?
Yeah.
Or is it like online, and therefore what do you click, and how many clicks are there, and like what does that mean, and like
Some
is it
people find that less
accessible?
intimidating. Some people find that more intimidating.
Exactly, right? You know, so and so, but that's actually really where this show begins. So there's something interesting about like, if you're thinking about like what the lobby means, which for a lot of venues, the lobby is like a milling place, right? The milling place. Sometimes it's a holding place, which I have problems with. But anyway, it holds you. You know, you're captive, right? Until you can get in, right? So these like areas of captivity. You know, it's interesting because I've been really thinking a lot about how theater holds you captive. And I find that really problematic, really problematic, even though I spent my whole life doing theater, right? So, but the notion of the captive audience, and that there's kind of there's stages of captivity that occur. There's the captivity in the lobby, which feels like a free space, but it really isn't, because it's being policed. And then there's being captive in the, if you're in an on-site venue, captive in the audience itself, and how that captivity is being treated. And obviously it's willful captivity, in the sense that, you know, if you've paid a ticket or not, you're consenting to that experience by being there. Somebody, or you came with a friend, right? But I'm thinking about like what that does to an audience's brain, and how there's ways that can be an easeful process. I'm going to go back to this idea of like Tasso sort of sending that, Tasso Stevens, for those of you who don't know, a co-founder of Coney. And so that I got the email for Magic Trick like a week before. And so already there was this notion of, I was living with the prompt for a week. And then I knew I had a task. And then I knew that I had an appointed time for the event. I was coming, but I had like a week to and I don't know, there was something about, I felt like I was in a lobby for a week before the event happened, you know. And then we had like there was the after event. And then there was a tale that he created where you could choose to be part of it or not. But for a week after the event was over, you would get like prompts every day to kind of reflect on the experience, to reflect on your own life regarding the initial questions that you had written down, come up with a new articulation of that. You were held accountable, but there was no pressure around it, which I found there was something, and that for me was really interesting, because I was thinking about that in relationship, and it's different from, but in relationship to the idea of the survey, right? So right now, every time I see a show, I get a survey right after it. And I'm starting to, and I know when people do it, you know, for marketing and demographics and all those things, but I'm also like, I kind of resent it, you know, because it makes me feel like a consumer. Do you know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah, it's really neoliberal. And it's also, I mean, it's also, unfortunately, I don't know, like over here, if you get surveys, it tends to be actually the Arts Council that is mandating it, because they want to see, who is supporting the work that they're supporting. And like, on the one hand, I don't know, you put yourself in the shoes of a tired arts administrator. And like, sometimes I have been that tired arts administrator, and you're just like, oh my God, like, we just need to do what we need to do. Like, calm down. And then you're like, but this is actually really dystopian. Like, this is part of the reason why we are constantly so exhausted and so overworked and so trying to make less and less money, stretch farther and farther, is because of the logic that leads to surveys like this.
Precisely, yeah. And I feel like there's also the pressure, like literally every interaction I have, like anything that has to do with, let's say, audience to venue or shop, like retail to consumer, has her survey attached to it. And I know that for like in the retail industry, the worker is judged, like there's sort of a system where it's like, if you do really well, like if you get good points on the survey, you might actually get a promotion. You might get more pay, you might get $1 more, right, a week. So there's this thing where you're beholden. The survey has become this, but you're not told that as the consumer. As a consumer, you're like, just fill this out, tell us how you're doing. And then I find out from like friends who are retail workers, who are like, no, I actually, it matters. Like, I actually rely, like, survey means something. It could affect my standing in the company. And I'm like, oh my gosh, like, this is like,
of course. And also,
right?
what a nightmare. Yeah.
What a nightmare, what a burden. And I guess, I think, I wish this will never happen. Maybe this is the utopian part of me thinking about, I just don't want to be a consumer. Do you know what I mean? Like, and when I'm making art or being in the audience or participant with art, I don't want to have the consumer brain approaching that. I want to be able to regard the experience and be part of the experience. This idea of,
and to maybe not be able to tick boxes right away. I don't know. Like, I think one of the things that I most value in pieces of art in general, but also theater in particular, is like the way in which it continues to live with you after the performance is done. And if it's like, and here's a quick survey, like, I'm not necessarily able to answer this checklist now, and I don't necessarily want to put my brain there, but like, also, I understand why collecting this data is necessary for you guys to make a living. And it's just like, it's just really rough.
Yeah, it's hard. I wanted to open up to other areas of your own work, and so tackle this as you will in our remaining minutes together. One of them, so pick your poison, as it were. So one of them has to do with the realm of autofiction, which I think your work straddles theatrically, and the other is game design. So which one do you want to pick, and go for it? And like, yeah,
let's pick game design.
Awesome. Tell us about your experience in game design, game/story design, and how that, your own work in that, but also how it impacts other areas of writing for performance for you.
Yeah. So when I was a kid in the U.S. and in high school in the U.S., obviously, I mean, I've realized as I'm telling the story, I'm like, I think this is normal, but it might not be normal. In my high school, when we were, like doing plays, the kind of default understanding of why people do stuff, to put it as baldly as possible, was like the Strasbourg-ish understanding of like Stanislavski and Strasbourg, like sort of what does the character want? What is stopping them from getting what they want? What are they doing to get it? What are the tactics that they're using to get around the obstacles? And in my, like later in my life, I have been able to make friends with this method a little bit more. But for a very long time, when I was younger, I was just like everything about it made me so angry. Because I was just like, this is not how anyone does anything. Like, I understand why, like on an almost institutional level, it is easier to think about human behavior in this way. But it's so boring. It's really, again, like people are such unconscious, like merc monsters. Like, why are you pretending that, that these interactions, and it also, I think it forces you to write interactions in which like somebody wants something, somebody is stopping them from getting it. So what are the tactics that they're going to use? And that kind of influences, I don't know, like it just all felt like I went to see a play. I'm not going to say which play because I'm about to really lay into it. But it's by a writer that I know that is, say, from the Mamet School. Not Mamet, but from the Mamet School. And it was basically so exclusively written in that mode. And it was a huge success. And the person that I went to see it with was like, that is the most Tory thing I've ever seen in my life. And it's true, this idea that human beings are just sharking around, like wanting stuff, and other people are stopping them from getting what they want, is like, it has strong political implications. It's that are just like very limited and don't account for most of how human beings actually interact with each other. So always hated it. Again, like in my old age, I'm kind of understanding its value as one of the tools in the toolbox in a different way than I did when I was a little younger. But the thing about games is that if you are, I don't know, like there's a possibility of playful cooperation. There's a possibility of playful subversion. There is, the thing, like the first question in game design is like, how do you win? But sometimes you don't win. Or sometimes like there are games that are designed in such a way that either everybody wins or nobody wins. And you can design other games in that, you know what I mean? Like, how do you win? Well, maybe you don't win. How do you win? You only win if everybody wins. How do you win? For instance, like being the most unselfish. Unselfish is already not a great way to put it because it's sort of negative rather than kind of its own. There's probably better words. One of them is charitable, but I don't really, generous perhaps. Anyway, maybe you can build in mechanisms that punish certain types of behavior. And again, like I'm not necessarily talking about like creating virtue systems, because sometimes something that is really enjoyable, especially in game theater, is being as villainous as possible, because there are no consequences, or no real world consequences in the way that it would be if you were that villainous in real life. Maybe it's a place to put aggression, or just like naughtiness, destructiveness. All of a sudden, so there's this worry that if we turn away from a Stanislavskian or a Strasbourg type approach, we're suddenly just like in a bog of words and no action, and like nothing is happening. And as soon as you begin to think about things in terms of game design, you're able to discover a dynamism to scenes and to entire plays that is not psychological in the ways that we like recognize it. So something that this thing of recognition makes me want to tell you something that is tangentially related, but perhaps perhaps the same thing. So for a long while, my day job was palm reading. I used to, I'm not sure if I ever told, oh my gosh, oh, we didn't know this.
Oh
Okay.
my gosh, no, oh my gosh, amazing.
Yeah, so I was, but it was always in like kind of areas where it was like definitely for entertainment only. It was at parties and at nightclubs. And I never wanted to do palm reading in areas where people might be seeking spiritual guidance in a genuine way. The reason being, like, I was scared of that responsibility, and I don't think it is appropriate to, like, I don't think it belongs to me. Maybe it doesn't belong to any of the people who work in that space, but it for sure doesn't belong to me. But the thing is that palm reading is, of course, a kind of game. I never did cold reading, which is when you try and figure out what the right thing is to say based on your assumptions about the person. I always obeyed the rules of the game as I was taught them, which is, the lines of the hand. But the thing is that you discover, and the few times that I like tried to deviate, that I like saw something, I was like, that's not right, and I said the opposite, like, I always got a negative reaction. Like, I don't, again, like, maybe many people I'm sure are just better cold readers than me, but like, what I found is that if I tried to game the system, it wouldn't work well for me. And so, yeah, that was part of the reason is I had no option but to sincerely read palms. But the thing that I found is that there was a space between the person as they knew themselves and the part of themselves that they didn't know. And oftentimes what was in the hands was closer to the part of themselves that they didn't know. And let me give you an example so that we're just definitely on the same page. I read a woman's palms once and I was like, oh, you're very intuitive. You read people really well. And she was like, no, that's completely wrong. Like, every relationship I've ever been in, like, people have fucked me over, like, da, 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 da. And I was like, oh, like, let me ask you to imagine the possibility. I was saying to her that you have always gone for the familiar, and what is familiar to you is being fucked over. And that it may be possible for you to perceive this before it happens, and it may be possible for you to make different choices. And so that is what I mean when I say that there's like the part of yourself that you know and the part of yourself that you don't know, that like actually, yeah, unfortunately, habits are hard to break. Yeah. And it can be beneficial to hold hands with a stranger who's sort of interested in you but doesn't have an agenda in your life and tries to read the lines of your palm. Sometimes that can be beneficial. I think that the most successful readings always take place somewhere between the self that you know and the self that you don't. Somewhere in this space. If you hit too hard into there, it is alienating and not much fun. If you are only sticking to this, it's kind of boring. You want the feeling of surprise and of something that's kind of just beyond recognition, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the things that games can give us as a dramaturgical tool. That it's like there's something almost biological about the way that games work on us, and that we can kind of understand play, even as adults, maybe especially as adults, and that beginning to think about not like what do I want and what's stopping me from getting what I want, but what is the game? Is it possible to win? what would that look like? What does it feel like to play this game? What are the rules of this game? Like, is this the game they're playing? Like, is it in the scene, say, is it a game like football where everyone's running around? Is it a game like poker where you don't have very much information? Like, a lot of the tension and interest comes from how much or how little information you're able to get about the other players. How do those different things feel in our bodies? How does it feel to play them versus watching them? I don't know. I think these are questions that yield a lot of dynamism and specificity when we begin to ask them about writing for theater.
Cool. What a beautiful words. It's lovely to hear. It's making me think of, have you read Andy Field's book Encounterism by chance?
I haven't yet. Because it's just come out. I
It's
want to read
just,
it.
it's brilliant. Shout out to Andy Field's book Encounterism, to all people out there in the world who are interested both in theater and life, because it's about the performance of life. And it just made me think about like his long history working with creative games in the street, like street games, and building those throughout his career, and yeah. So and the importance of, and he talks a lot about this thing of like what the reality of what we're in, but also the thing that's like outside of us that we're searching for or imagining, and that those things are always in some coexistence with one another, but sometimes there's a lack of awareness around that. There's only like, I'm only here, I can't see the other, right? I can't see where else I could be. Yeah, so this notion of possibility and potentiality, which is part of the world of games, but also the world of theater and performance. So what a pleasure to have you here today, Eve. Thank you for making time. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's just a delight, and please, keep making the beautiful things that you make.
Likewise, thank you so much. And yeah, like I'm always saying, like every new Caridad Svich play is a brocha. Like it's I don't know. Yeah, I'm like embarrassed now, but yeah, the frequency you write on is very, very special.
Thank you.
And I don't know of anyone else who is able to get there.
Oh, that's very sweet. Shout out for keeping. I just want to keep writing, you. I just try to keep making things. It's funny. Ocean Vuong had that interview in The Observer not long ago, and was talking about stopping writing, like saying, I've gotten to my end. And I was like, that's such an interesting space to be in, because that sort of says how I was interpreting that. Who knows? I'm not in Ocean Vuong's head, but that's sort of the space where you're like stopped the curiosity. Do you know what I mean? Where you think, well, yeah, I figured it, and it's sort of, and there's I think it was Mark Ravenhill was talking about this. He was talking to Jan Fosse, and at one point Jan Fosse said, I figured out what plays do, I'm done. No, it's Simon Stevens talking to Jan Fosse, and he was like, he said he figured it out, so he had no more interest in writing plays ever again. And I was like, oh, I hope I never get there. I want to know, to me, it's still like, what could happen next? I don't know. Like the curiosity is what makes me keep writing. I think that I'm scared. I'm actually terrified of being in a place of like, I figured it out. I have nothing else to learn of what theater can do. Because it feels to me like, an infinite form, weirdly, which is part of the reason I'm attracted to it. But all those good things. Anyway, I'll hit stop recording. Thanks everyone for whoever's out there in the dark or in the light watching us. But I'll hit stop recording now.